Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. A little bit past noon here in Central Standard Time. And nice to have you here with us, even if it's virtually. Mike, my trusty assistant today, last week or 2 weeks ago, I was his trusty assistant. Today, Mike has the YouTube feed up on a laptop, so he's able to see you if you say hello, or ask a question, or otherwise have some feedback. Mike, there's a way, you know how to mute that with the little speaker down there so you don't get feedback?
I'm not sure. Over here?
Here, hang on just a second.
Okay.
All right, so we're good to go. Anyway, welcome. Thanks to the church for continuing to host Science Sunday and other programs. Our audience is purely online today. We have a couple of technicians that are helping us with the live feed. Thank you very much. And the two of us are here. It's really difficult to talk, in some sense, to an empty room. So I really appreciate the moral, intellectual, and comedic support of having my science chum here by my side. Thank you, Mike.
Sure. It's good to be here. It's fun. I notice you have this schedule for November.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, my slide, November. Well, I guess that's appropriate.
Right.
I don't know what December will be. December. Descending into winter, I don't know. I do put an extra E in there or something. Speaking of December, I want to talk about cosmic ornaments. So, you know, today's talk is mostly about food science with a little surprise I'm going to tack on to the beginning. But in December, in recognition of many holidays around the world, I want to talk a little bit about ornaments, cosmic ornaments.
Oh.
We'll see how that goes.
Nice.
All right, so some of you may not be aware of the fact that for many years as an adult, probably ending about 5 or 8 years ago, for many years I ran a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And it was for adults, and when I say it was for adults, I don't mean that it was full of sophomoric, psychosexual humor or anything like that. I mean that I tried to present to the people who played, those of you who haven't played what's called a role-playing game, the idea is that you, the players, invest themselves in fleshing out a character that lives an imagined adventure in an imagined world with an imagined personality. That personality can be virtuous, it can be despicable, etc. But the idea of role-playing is that you try to inhabit, it's almost like method acting. You try to inhabit the role of a character in a story. And as the game master, it was my job typically to invent the story. So I would invent ethical dilemmas and issues involving socio-political, economic complexities and whatnot that the players had to think through and whatnot.
But you did that in person and people were meeting?
Right, yeah.
In costume or in
We never did the
persona?
costume. You can do that. Some people take it to the extreme of doing costumed role-playing. But we were just adults gathered around a table once or twice a month for several years. And you may wonder why I'm bringing that up, especially if my goal today is to talk about food science. Well, I want to start with a little bit of an off-topic thing that I've been thinking about recently, but I don't think it's a significant enough topic to take up the whole hour. So here's the gist of it. You know, we have a new president-elect, and I've been thinking a bit about that. You know, this fellow, Joe Biden, he's been in the public eye for a very long time. So one of the things that is commonly said about him is that people feel like they know him. You know, we've seen some of his gaffes, some of his more genuine moments, some of his emotional turmoil with his personal life, etc. And, you know, we're all wondering what kind of president he will be. And it occurs to me that we may reasonably expect him to be a similar kind of president to the other one pictured here on this slide, George Washington. Now, why do I say that? Well, remember, I was talking about role playing, and psychologists recognize that we all play roles. We play different roles at different times. We're husband, mother, counselor, teacher, student, spectator, leader, follower, builder or destroyer, critic or supporter. In different situations at different times, as the situation warrants, we try to assume different roles. We have in our minds this idea of the kind of person we want to be, or the kind of person that we're expected to be in terms of societal expectations. So it's a combination of sociology and psychology that feeds in to these models that we try to pin ourselves to in our minds as we are role-playing through different parts of life. And we do what we think is proper and prudent as the situation or tradition or social expectations warrant. You know, some do this sort of role-playing, this method acting, most of the time. For some people, it's only done occasionally, and for others, very rarely. But even the people who role-play very rarely are likely to behave in expected ways in some situations. You know, they're likely to be quiet in church rather than interrupting and yelling out their own opinions. They're likely not to talk in an elevator, you know, different things like that. So even the most obstreperous and nonconformist among us finds him or herself playing roles more or less frequently. You know, one of the statements that is common in modern parlance is, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." And there's another one that's also common, and that is, "Be yourself." These dictums, each one difficult in of itself, often war with each other inside the maelstrom of our character and our decision-making. They war for ascendancy. You know, the trick, I think, is to make yourself deliberately, with careful forethought and intention, the sort of person you wish to see and be in the world. To play out the role of your best and most virtuous self as often as possible. Now, what does this have to do with Joe Biden and George Washington? Well, some of you may recall from reading or some history class or other that when he was a teenager, George Washington compiled a list of 110 sort of dictums for behavior. And if you follow George Washington's life subsequently, you can see that he tried deliberately to exemplify some of these virtuous behaviors. 110 of them. I have the entire list here. You can find the list easily online. But there are things like every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those who are present.
There's one about not cutting down a cherry tree, I believe.
You know, I think the cherry tree one got omitted from the list. Maybe that was added by an editor later,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Many times.
Yeah. Do not laugh too loud or too much in any public spectacle. We've heard people in movie theaters that violate that a bit, or plays. Let's see. In visiting the sick, do not presently play the physician if you be not knowing therein. That's pretty good advice, don't you think?
Don't start trying to heal people if you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's 110 of these, and my point is that, especially in his leadership positions, George Washington, I believe, behaved deliberately and intentionally to try and fill the role of the President of the United States.
He knew he was maybe setting a standard that might try to be replicated from here on out in a new country, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, he was very conscientious of the fact that he was setting a standard and setting some precedents, some of which were not formally enshrined in any law or constitution, but have become traditions that are followed mostly to this day. With one glaring example I can think of a person who's flouting some of the traditional role plays of office. But I think Joe Biden has a lot of fixing to do. I think that he is conscientious and conscious of the fact that setting an example and returning to decorum and presidential comportment is important. And I think it's likely, I don't know the man, I feel like I know him a little bit because I've seen so much of him, but I suspect it's likely that he will also behave with a very deliberate sort of comportment and intentionality that will serve him and us well. And I hope it's true.
I think he's made a point in some regards of trying to say that he's bringing us back to normalcy, or
Right.
which I think is implying that not so much normal or abnormal, but bringing us to the point in which we can have some level of comfort and expectation and understanding of what we think the leader of the world should be doing, the leader of our country ought to be doing.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would ask somebody, Mike, you can check out YouTube there. I would ask if somebody can let us know whether or not you can hear Mike when he's speaking, because when I was using that microphone a couple weeks ago, I got some feedback, as it were, that it was hard to hear me. So if somebody can let us know whether you can hear Mike when he's speaking, I would appreciate that.
Hey, Mike, you may want to just grab the microphone, hold it.
All right.
All right, so to close out this theme, this is a photograph of author Peter S. Beagle, who was born in, I believe, 1939, wrote or somewhere around there, 34 maybe, wrote a book in 1969 that has become iconic. It's called The Last Unicorn. And I loved this book as a young adult. And I still read it every once in a while. It's got some pithy observations about life and reality in it. And one of them is, we are not always what we seem and hardly ever what we dream. So even though we may have this aspirational, deliberate notion of the roles we want to play and the kind of person we want to be, we're human and we sometimes fall short. But setting that model in our own minds, I think, is still important. And it's something that we personally respond to in terms of our own character and bearing, and it's something that other people respond to. And then the other thing that came out of that Last Unicorn book is that great heroes need great sorrows and burdens, or half their greatness goes unnoticed. It's all part of the fairy tale. And we can think about the implications of that as well. All right, well, thank you for indulging me. Not that you had much choice if you've tuned in. I guess you could have been going away to get a cup of coffee or something. But without further ado, let's turn to food science. All right, food nourishes the body. It excites the senses. We even pepper our language with delicious metaphorical words that harken back to the visceral effects food has on our reactions and dispositions. Disingenuous sentiments are saccharine, often spoon-fed to us by spoiled, rotten people who wish to butter us up. It's done in bad taste. We can hardly stomach the bitterness of sourpusses who stew and fret as they let off steam. We relish the thought that they will reap what they sow and choke on their own hard-to-swallow words, especially those we find sickening. Those of us with good taste seldom spit out such unpalatable sentiments. We're far more likely to pepper our language with tasteful praise and avoid watered-down plain vanilla pablum. We use rich and flavorful words, words that have us commenting on the sweet disposition of others. We call one another sweetheart, honey, and sugar as we gather together, cool as cucumbers, to chew the fat and enjoy the variety that is the spice of life. Now, I hope you're not feeling salty today. I hope you savor the science we're about to talk about. You know, Mike, I don't want to be the top banana today, and I don't want to get myself into a pickle as I ham it up. Can I count on you to save my bacon if some half-baked ideas turn out to be not such a piece of cake?
I would find it very savory to do that.
All right. Well, let's talk turkey then.
All right.
All right, a little bit, before we delve too deeply, a little bit about food chemistry. So, one of the things you often hear about are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the energy of life. We hear about that, you know, if you're going to do something strenuous, you want to load up on carbs, carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates have interesting chemical formulas. It's generally some number, that's represented by N in this symbolic equation I've written here. It's a number of carbon atoms plus some number M, some different number, of hydrogen and oxygen, often combined into OH or regular old H2O, water. So in that sense, carbohydrates get their name because they're hydrated carbons.
Right.
Couldn't be simpler. But carbohydrates have very interesting properties. You know, here's what's called a simple sugar. This is the sugar that circulates in your bloodstream to provide energy to your cells as they are oxidized. This is glucose. Chemical formula, C6H12O6. Well, you could break that down into 6 carbons and 6 waters. And literally, your body breaks that down when it combines some of the carbon with oxygen to make CO2. You breathe oxygen in from the air. The oxygen bonds to some of the carbon in carbohydrates within the machinery of cells. And you're left with some energy, and you output carbon dioxide. This is kind of the three-dimensional shape of this glucose molecule. And these three-dimensional shapes are very, very, very important. Let me say it again. Very.
Extremely.
Extremely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I run out of synonyms occasionally.
I haven't noticed that.
And then we get fructose, which is a different sugar. But look at its chemical formula. You see something similar there? Fructose and glucose have the same chemical formula. How can that be? How can it be that they're two different things with different names if they have the same chemical formula? Well, that's because what I talked about a moment ago. The shape is important. The shape of a fructose versus a glucose is different. And your body produces enzymes, for example, that can snip apart other chemicals or react with other chemicals by bringing certain other molecules or atoms into proximity with the target molecule. And in order for those enzymes and those processes to work, the geometry, the geometric configuration of the target molecule and the molecule that's being brought into service must literally align. It's a mechanical problem. It's an electrochemical problem. One of the things that many carbohydrates and other complicated biochemical molecules exhibit are hydrogen bonds. You know that one part of a water atom is slightly positively charged. That would be the parts with the hydrogen. So a water molecule looks kind of like Mickey Mouse. if you can picture Mickey Mouse. And the ears, where the hydrogen attaches to the oxygen, tend to be a little positively charged, and the chin of Mickey Mouse is negatively charged. And the whole molecule overall has a net neutral charge, but this polarity, this unequal distribution of the charge within the molecule, can lead to some residual charges. And these residual charges, especially in biochemistry, form what are called hydrogen bonds. And so you have molecules adjacent to one another that attract or repel because of the polarity, the complicated polarities that arise in things like amino acids and carbohydrates and whatnot. So the details of the chemistry become almost arbitrarily complicated, but my point is that you can have the same chemical formula, but very different physical and even chemical, not to mention metabolic behaviors for the same chemical that you could write down in high school, the same chemical formula of C6H12O6. And these are called isomers, the different shapes of a molecule with the same atomic constituents. Well, if you combine fructose and glucose together, you can get the most common thing that we know of as sugar, which is table sugar. And that's sucrose. That's what's shown in the bowl up there at top. Any questions or anything on YouTube, Mike? Anybody said anything?
No, not yet.
Okay. So one of the other things about carbohydrates is that in general, carbohydrates are some combination of these relatively more basic building blocks. Relatively more fundamental, I should say, building blocks. Basic is a special thing in chemistry. And because carbohydrates are built up from these simple sugars, food scientists and chemists have recognized that no matter what the carb is, whether it comes from rice or wheat or something else, all carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram, because you're measuring the weight of the sugars. Now, some of those sugars may be stuck together in very long chains, larger than sucrose. Some of the carbohydrates could be vastly more complicated than that. But one of the processes of your digestive system, including saliva, is to break apart carbohydrates, and eventually you end up with some of these simple sugars. Mm-hmm. Well, carbohydrates are one of the primary ingredients in any kind of food, in many kinds of food that we eat. We can certainly eat food that has no carbs, as people on the Atkins diets and whatnot can attest to. But carbohydrates are a typical part of a typical diet. Another typical part of a typical diet are fats and oils. You could have vegetable oils, you can have animal product oils like fish oil, or the oil rendered from the fats in animals. And these fats go into making some extraordinarily different sorts of molecules with different behaviors. One of the things about fats is that they're typically long chain molecules that have a water-loving side and a water-phobic side, hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And so fats, when immersed in water, tend to form globules, for example. But you can also entice, through various cooking methods, you can entice some of those globules to fully encompass or surround other particles. And so you can keep some particles from settling out of solution by emulsifying them in fats. And that's the trick in a lot of different sweet things like cookies and pie crusts and whatnot, among other uses. Fats and oils contain hydrocarbons, typically in long chains. This is a picture of a I believe this is a
Triglyceride.
Yeah, triglyceride. And you'll notice that even a triglyceride is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, there are other trace elements that are relevant to biochemistry, things like nitrogen and sulfur and phosphorus and whatnot. And often those are tacked on to some of these more simple things like triglycerides and simple sugars. So some of the facts about fats and oils: they're not soluble in water. They have various melting points, right? Butter will melt in your hand, but your hand tends to be a little cooler than the interior of your body, so chocolate, specifically the oil in chocolate, cocoa butter, doesn't melt at the slightly cooler temperature of your hand, but it will melt at body temperature, at 98.6 or whatever the human body temperature is. Another thing about fats and oils is they're flavored by fat-soluble molecules. This is really important. Most of the spices that people use, and I'm not talking about salt and pepper specifically, I'm talking about, coriander and paprika and basil and some of these other sources of flavorful molecules that we like to taste in our food. Most of those molecules are actually fat-soluble, not water-soluble. I think I have some verbiage about that. Let's see. Just looking through my notes. Yeah, here we go. It's no accident that the use of spices in food correlates with the average temperature of the region from which the recipe is derived. Temperatures that promote the growth of bacterial and fungal spoilage organisms, temperatures that promote the growth are prevalent in countries where foods are heavily spiced. The essential oils in sage, mint, hyssop, etc. have bacteriostatic effects. They prevent some bacteria from growing and multiplying, such as E. coli and Listeria. The essential oils from oregano are bactericidal. The bacteria are actually killed. These effects are most pronounced on certain other toxic bacteria. Strong antimicrobial activity is found in cinnamon, cloves, and mustard. Less pronounced effects occur from allspice, bay leaf, caraway, coriander, cumin, rosemary, and they're similar to the effects of sage and oregano. Black pepper, red pepper, and ginger have very weak antimicrobial activity. Garlic and onion are effective against salmonella, E. coli, and staphylococcus. Cinnamon, cloves, and sage all contain eugenol, E-U-G-E-N-O-L, eugenol, I guess, an effective antimicrobial and mold inhibitor that is used in mouthwashes and baked goods. Sage and oregano contain thymol, another effective antimicrobial, often used in toothpastes. The oleoresins in rosemary also act as antioxidants and prevent the rancidity of fats and oils in food. And many of these different spices and flavoring, what we think of is just adding flavor to our food, many of these are more soluble in fats and oils than they are in water. So some scientific references I've researched about cooking say that many of these kinds of spices and herbs should be first dissolved in oils before you add them to your food. So for example, if you're making chili and you put in canned tomatoes and then beans, and the beans are typically in water and whatnot, and then you add paprika, well, you're actually inhibiting the spread of that paprika and the flavor molecules that are locked in that paprika from suffusing into your food. So a suggestion in one of the YouTube videos I watched about scientific cooking says that you should cook your paprika in a little bit of butter and onion and garlic, and then add that mixture into your chili to make sure that the oil-soluble flavor proteins, and again, some of them have antimicrobial properties, make sure that those are more evenly and thoroughly distributed into your food.
I know there's a whole historical aspect to this too, that just the use and the acquisition of different types of spices were very important in the medieval times. It started a lot of activity, transitioning, moving to different areas to trade with people, to
Right.
acquire the spices that would keep people's food in days prior to any kind of effective refrigeration or anything else that kept microbial
Right.
levels down. If you could get these spices, they could, I thought it was mainly masking the effects of
Right.
rancidity or spoilage or anything
That was
like
certainly
that.
a part of it.
Yeah, and maybe that's all that the people at that time recognized about
Right.
it. They obviously didn't understand
microbes.
microbial action, but it was actually effective in ways, not just masking the bad taste of something turning bad, but also having an effect on reducing this rancidity, salting
Right.
and doing different things that limited
Right.
the microbial action.
Right, and salt is a good preservative because it wicks out moisture, and a lot of the microbes require a moist environment to thrive. All right, so I've talked about carbohydrates, I've talked about fats and oils. One of the other common components of the food we eat are proteins. Now, proteins are the micro machines of life. You read about mitochondria and other organelles within the cell, and all of the complicated machinery in a cell, including the way muscle fibers work with actin and whatnot. All of the complicated, quite literal machinery of life, the three-dimensional, energy-consuming, energy-liberating organelles and chemical processes rely on the infinite malleability and variety that one can obtain from stringing together a few amino acids. Mike, how many are there again? You remember?
22, I think.
Yeah, somewhere like that.
23.
Yeah, 20, somewhere between 20 and 22 amino acids. And with these 20-ish building blocks, you can construct all kinds of incredible machinery and support structures as well. Collagen and lignin and other things that are in fingernails and hair and that make tree trunks solid and strong, to the pectin in fruits and other sort of gross anatomical features that provide structure and form, as well as the machinery that does its work inside of cells. And proteins, one of the things, some of you may have heard of this notion of protein folding being important. Remember earlier when I was talking about the carbohydrates, one of the things I stressed was that the shape of the molecule is really important to its function and its biological role. Well, that same thing applies in spades to proteins. So a misformed or malformed protein, which typically goes by the name of a prion, can lead to all sorts of knock-on deleterious consequences for a living organism. You can have prion diseases. The chemical structure of the protein is the same, but it is folded incorrectly, and your body is replicating these malformed proteins, malfolded proteins, and it can cause diseases and malfunctions. So proteins, the geometric three-dimensional shape and distribution of those hydrogen bonds and other polar charges on amino acids that are placed in specific locales due to protein folding, that's all important for the way that the machinery of life works. But it's really hard to break apart one of those tightly folded proteins. And one of the interesting facts about human beings is that I think, if I remember correctly, we only make like 9 out of 20 amino acids that we synthesize in our own bodies. And that means 11 of them have to come from the food we eat. We still have to get these amino acids to make our own proteins. So where do we get them from? We get them from our food. But it's hard to break apart proteins, right? There are special enzymes that do it, that have evolved to help us with digestion. But fortunately, human beings, I think we're the only ones. I don't think I've heard about any other. There may be something that uses a hot volcanic vent, maybe, to cure or cook some food. Something's tickling my memory about that a little bit. Maybe a squid or something. Squids are always doing weird and amazing things. Don't take my word on that. Look it up for yourself. That wasn't something I wrote down. It's just, but in any case, let's be safe and say that human beings are the only species on Earth that cooks its food. Let's just cut right to the chase. And cooking the food, when you apply heat to these proteins, it does something called denaturing them. It causes them to unfold, like this picture that you see on your left. And when you denature proteins, you make it easier for enzymes and other digestive mechanisms to snip some of those necessary amino acids out of the consumed protein and repurpose them. All right, so I've talked about carbohydrates, and I've talked about fats and oils, and I've talked about proteins, and that's really it, other than some of the trace minerals that we must have to survive, like iron in our blood and whatnot. By the way, a lot of the iron in our blood comes, we get it from cooking utensils. Kind of interesting. So let's talk about one of our favorite things. Every culture on Earth has a tradition of bread. And
You'd wonder about like the Inuit or something way up north in Alaska and how they do.
oh, right. When I say every culture, maybe that's incorrect. Maybe there are cultures that live in places where there aren't many grains.
Well, and maybe they do have something that takes its place, but for the most part, I agree. It's been a very civilizing structure, the capacity to store grains and then make it into cereals and breads and different things like that is pretty common. Most places, something just flashed. What do they do way up in the Arctic Circle or something like
Right.
that?
Great point. I don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know. Maybe somebody watching the YouTube can look that up while we're talking here and type the answer into the YouTube chat
That would be nice, yes.
to help ameliorate all of our collective ignorance.
Satisfy that hunger for
Right.
knowledge.
Nice. Well done. Well done. All right. So, bread. One of the main component of breads is flours. We've got bread flour, we've got cake flour, and we've got all-purpose flour, etc. And not all-purpose flours are created equal. For example, a person I know who likes making bread really prefers King Arthur flour over gold medal flour. This person happens to be my husband, says, I think King Arthur flour just makes for a firmer, more tasteful bread. I just like it more. Well, it turns out that King Arthur flour has 11.7% protein in it, and gold medal flour has 10.5% protein in it. And that protein is expressed in the form of gluten. And gluten, as you may surmise from its name, are molecules that glue together. Gluten when exposed to water, can form sheets or masses of glued together material. You know, you remember from grade school when you used to mix flour and water to make glue, right? That's the gluten in flour that enables that property. And King Arthur flour has slightly more gluten. Now, if you are gluten intolerant, what are you to do? Well, you can get other sorts of material that can serve in the place of gluten, maybe a little less effectively, but things like xanthan gum comes from the dried cell coat of a microorganism called Xanthomonas campestris, I guess. You can purchase it in health food stores and some supermarkets. Guar gum powder comes from the seed of a plant, Siamopsis. I'm not even going to pronounce this second word. You can look up guar gum. It's an excellent gluten substitute, and it's available in health food stores and some supermarkets. Pre-gelled starch. This gluten substitutes helps keep baked goods from being too crumbly. This, too, can be purchased at most health food stores. So there are some food products that we can...
Alternatives.
Yeah, alternatives. So you can buy gluten-free flour, or just start with a gluten-free flour. Let's see, what do we got? I guess these are all flours up here on this slide, but buckwheat flour, for example, which isn't related to the plant that we get flour from, wheat. But buckwheat flour tends not to form the bonds that you need to make bread, but you can add one of these other substitutes and make bread out of it. So gluten-free flour is not good at making breads and cakes because you want the structural component of bread and cake to be somewhat sticky. Bread is actually a foam, like a sponge, like an undersea sponge or a bath sponge. If you look at bread and its texture, it's spongy. And that's because of leavening agents, which I'll talk about in a moment, that percolate through the sheets and tangle of gluten and create air pockets. Well, you can't do that if you don't have gluten to form the sheets and spongy material to capture some of those bubbles. Cake flour. What's the deal with cake flour? Well, cake flour has relatively less gluten, so it doesn't form long bonded filaments. If you look at the texture of cakes, they tend to be different. In fact, I've got some slides on that. So here's bread, spongy looking, right? Big holes in bread. Cake tends to have a more crumbly structure. Right, I agree. Cake is delicious. But its texture is quite different than bread, even though it's got many of the same ingredients. And then cookies. Cookies, talk about crumbly. Cookies may have little to no internal gluten bonds, and so you can use flours that have less gluten to make cookies, or you can otherwise inhibit the formation of those gluten bonds through other chemical means when you make cookie recipes, such as trapping the gluten in fats. That's why one of the reasons you add butter to cookies but not to bread.
Bread, huh?
But simple ingredients: yeast, flour, water. Optionally, a little dash of salt, at least for flavor, and you can make bread. Now, interestingly, one of the other things I learned when researching this talk is, you know, that gray-white scum that forms on the surface of grapes and plums?
That's yeast.
That's yeast.
Right.
You knew that.
Yeah, yeah,
I like that about you.
yeah.
And so yeah, that's yeast, and you could, in principle, scrape some of that off and use it to start your own yeast culture, your own starter. Now there's yeast spores floating around in the atmosphere, and so you can just put flour and water together in a bowl, and yeast will find a home there. Yeast spores that are in the atmosphere, and you can start going sourdough and whatnot. Very simple ingredients, but I'll say near universal in deployment.
I think yeast is critical in the making of wine too, and I'm not sure how, I can't explain it too well, but it's on there and it's part of the manufacture of wine.
Yeah.
I'm not wise enough to know how it applies.
And beers too.
Yeah.
And there are different sorts of yeasts, like high yeast and low yeast, something like that, that have to do with the temperature at which they're active and whatnot. I don't remember a lot of the details about that. All right, let's talk about one of the other wonderful things about cooking, and this is the Maillard. It's pronounced Mayard Reactions, after a Frenchman who discovered this, I don't know, about 1911 or so, if I'm remembering correctly. I've got a note about it here somewhere. But, all right, let's see what I've got here about Mayard Reactions. Thought I had a sheet where I talked about it.
What always amazes me is the fact of how this stuff was developed, how they realized that developing, generations ago, hundreds of generations ago, how adding baking soda or baking powder or these different elements in changed the whole structure of what was being cooked.
Right.
And that to me is fascinating.
Yeah, and they didn't know chemistry per se,
Right.
but they knew the practical effects of different things. I do have a couple pages here about all kinds of yeast. If anybody has any specific questions, Mike, you can own those if anybody asks any questions about yeasts.
Okay.
The Maillard reaction is a chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that give browned food its distinctive flavor. Seared steaks, fried dumplings, cookies, and other kinds of biscuits and breads, toasted marshmallows, and many other foods undergo this Maillard reaction. It's named for French chemist Louis Maillard, who first, how did you like that? Was that good?
Pretty good. Yeah.
Who first described it in 1912, not 1911. I was off by a year, while attempting to reproduce biological protein synthesis. Heat, moisture, and time may be key to getting the Maillard reaction going, but without proteins and sugars to work with, it simply won't happen. For example, celery doesn't brown.
Yeah.
There's no sugars in celery. Proteins are long chains of amino acids crumpled up like wads of paper. Some of them are Maillard susceptible, meaning they really love to bond with sugars. But not just any sugar. Molecules of complex sugars, like starches and table sugars, are too big to react with Maillard proteins. Instead, these proteins require reducing sugars, which are essentially simple sugars, like we talked about before, that attract amino acids at certain moisture and temperature levels. Often, that's hotter than boiling water. So the Maillard reactions require something like 350, 400 degrees, and not the temperature of boiling water. So you can boil something, like a piece of meat, to cook it to the point where it's warm enough to be palatable and not dangerous, but it's not going to be very appetizing. But if you cook it in a skillet where the bottom of the skillet gets to be much above the boiling point of water, then you can instigate some of these Maillard reactions. The Maillard reactions start with a somewhat limited set of proteins and sugar molecules, and these bond and mix over time. And as that happens, more and more new molecules are added to the equation. They're synthesizing complicated molecules. Mm-hmm. It's kind of an incestuous molecular orgy when you stop to think about it.
Well, it started with a Frenchman, so I can understand why.
Oh, good point. Very good point. These promiscuous molecules mix and match over and over, billions and trillions of times per second, on the surface of a food, forming a growing, recursive, recombinatory aroma and a flavor engine. And by the way, the details of the Maillard reaction, all of the flavoroids that are produced, the flavorful molecules that titillate the taste buds and that smell good, the chemistry of that is still being unraveled 100 years after Mayard discovered it. It's very complicated chemistry, but it creates new flavors that are not present if you just, for example, boil meat or sous vide it, which is another way to pre-prepare your meat. So a sous vide is a water bath that you keep at a particular temperature, typically below boiling unless it's under pressure. And you can cook food so that it's safe and edible in a sous vide and keep it cooked for hours. A lot of restaurants do this. And then they take it out and they just flop it in a hot skillet to brown it, a Mayard reaction.
Just fast, Susan Ross responded that Google says that Inuits eat bannock, a flatbread made of flour and fried in fat, baked or cooked on a stick. It doesn't say if this is a new food or if the history they had before flour may have been available.
Interesting.
So they may have developed this with traders or trade
Right.
bring things in, or it may be a newer acquirement from,
I know there's a thing called winter wheat. Now, I'm not an agronomist or a farmer by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know if winter wheat means that it is wheat that is, finds Arctic or northern
No, I
climates
think it's
on it.
planted at a certain time and it's better able to. I think it lasts through the winter and then it sprouts early in the spring.
Okay.
That's what I understand about it.
I wonder if there's a wheat or a rice or something that makes carbs that does grow in the north. I don't know.
So thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So here's some more details about the Mayard reaction, some of the chemistry that's known about it. You can feel free to review this YouTube video at some later time and pause on this slide, or you can look this up. But the Mayard reaction, like I said, this could be a fully cooked turkey immersed in a water bath. And the potatoes could have been fully cooked, but it's the Mayard reaction that happens at the surface that makes all of those yummy, flavorful chemicals, including the brown crunchiness of toast and the crust of bread. Chewy and fluffy on the inside, kind of like me.
Mm-hmm.
So to make bread, you've got two things. You've got the Mayard reaction, and then you've also got leavening. Leavening agents like yeast, which metabolizes some of the sugars and releases carbon dioxide, just like we do. They're a member of the fungal animal kingdom, and they go munch, 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 munch on the sugars, some of the carbohydrates, and release CO2, and those CO2s get caught and trapped by the gluten, as I mentioned previously, and make these big cells of air. And then the yeast itself, when they break down in the oven, and unfortunately, billions of them lose their lives every time we make bread. Moment of silence. Their cooked remains add to the flavor of bread and beer and wine and whatnot. Baking soda is another way to get leavening. You add baking soda, which releases CO2 as it comes into contact with an acid. So typically whenever you add baking soda, you'll add something that has acid, either a dry acid, which I believe is something like cream of tartar, or acid like vinegar, etc.
Is that what leavening really means, the formation of CO2 pockets?
Yeah.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
So leavened bread and leavened.
Yeah, unleavened
rises,
bread is
yeah.
not rising. So baking soda is just a chemical reaction that releases CO2. Baking powder is baking soda plus a dry acid combined with it, so that all you have to do is add water and the chemical reaction starts and it makes gas bubbles. So baking soda keeps almost indefinitely, although it can pick up acidic odors and flavors. That's why people put an open box of it in their fridge. Baking powder, on the other hand, can lose its potency over a period of a few months because its chemicals react slowly with each other, especially if exposed to humid air, a little bit of that water. Test your baking powder by adding some water. If it does not fizz vigorously, it's lost its potency, and you should throw it away and get some more. All right, this is one of the great horrors of a typical home kitchen. After you instigate the Mayard process, you're left with something that the French people, obviously, right, who know all about cooking, call fond. It's the remains that are in the bottom of the pan. Now, these aren't ashes. It's not burnt food, typically, if you cook it correctly. But this is some of the most flavorful stuff possible from the art of cooking, is this fond that's left in pans. And most them fancy restaurants that serve food with sauces. We may call it just gravy, but all kinds of different sauces. Those sauces start by enlisting the flavor compounds in the residue left in a pan from cooking things like mushrooms or meat. So great sauces derive from things that we typically scrape off and wash down the drain. Potatoes. Potatoes contain a lot of starches. The anatomy of a starch. Lots of little blocks, blockets assemble, blocklets, I should say, in granules of starch. And potatoes lend themselves to being whipped and cut, and lots of protein in them to do the Mayard processes, etc. But they don't form sticky sheets, right? You can't form potato bread with nothing but potatoes. Sugar. I go through some of this relatively quickly. Might run a couple minutes over. I hope you don't mind. When we cut up a potato, well, let's talk about potatoes again. When we cut up a potato and roast it, a sequence of events takes place. First, the water on the exposed surface mostly boils off, bursting the starches open into a fluffy mass and breaking them down into simpler sugars. As the heat on those surfaces increases, again, this is potatoes, due to the loss of water, the proteins and broken down sugars familiar to us begin to break down even more and recombine in the Mayard reactions. That smell of roasted potatoes tells your body that it's in the presence of a food that can provide it with nutrients it not only needs but can readily use. Take a bite and your mouth confirms it's delicious. Wait a minute, some of you are saying mashed potatoes are my fave and they aren't Mayarded at all. You make an important point. Boiled and steamed potatoes and other foods, because of the high volume of water present and the lower temperature, remember water boils at 212 and doesn't get any hotter unless it's under pressure, right. Do not undergo the Mayard reaction, yet can still produce delicious results. So it works good for a potato, but not so good with a turkey. Sugar. You mix sugar and butter together. It's called creaming them. This makes a mixture that's light and fluffy. Little sugar crystals, when mixed with solid fats, dig little divots into the butter fat, and they aerate it. You get a nice fluffy mixture when you mix sugar and a fat, especially a solid fat like butter. Sugar is hygroscopic. It attracts moisture in the air and keeps sealed sugary foods from going stale by trapping water. Interesting enough. So if you seal up a bag, make some cookies, seal them up in a bag, the cookies will trap whatever residual moisture is in the bag, deprive that moisture from other microorganisms that might otherwise use it to thrive. Sugar depresses the freezing temperature of water. Okay, I got a question for you.
All right.
What do you think the mixing ratio possible is between sugar and water? Is it like 1:1? Half the amount of sugar can dissolve in a unit of water? Is it 1:1? 1 unit of sugar can dissolve in the same quantity of water? What do you think?
I'm guessing a 1/5 to 1.
20% to 1? Okay. It's 2 to 1. You can dissolve twice the amount of sugar in water as compared to the amount of water. So you have a cup of water, you can dissolve 2 cups of sugar into it. And you can do amazing things with sugar because of that. It goes through different physical phase changes as it heats up and cools down. You can make hardtack, soft ball, hard ball, all kinds of different, and caramel. You mix in some fats like milk. You can make caramel in your own kitchen. It's really easy to do. Should never buy caramel. Well, I don't know, you should never. I don't feel that strongly about it. But you certainly can create your own caramel. When I make my own apple pie at home, which I'll talk about it here at the end, I make my own caramel. And I make it apple flavored by taking some of the macerated juices that collect from the apple mixture, and I mix that apple juice into the mixture for the caramel. Salt. All right, when you're cooking with salt, whenever something says to add a particular kind of salt, generally speaking, that's the ego of the chef speaking, not chemistry, right? Unless it's for texture. So salt on the surface of things, or salt crystals that are incorporated inside of things like cookies where the salt doesn't disperse in the liquid. Salt is salt, regardless of whether it starts off with big crystals or small crystals, when you dissolve it in some solution. Again, when it's there for texture and taste, and the texture is a big part of it, different kinds of salt are important. When cooking, generally speaking, you should try an experiment where you use iodized salt and non-iodized salt. You will taste a difference. Quite literally, iodized salt gives a metallic flavor to things that are cooked with it. So if you find that objectionable or not, make a batch of cookies with iodized salt and another batch with regular salt and see if you can taste the difference. One of the things about koshering salt is that it typically doesn't have iodine in it. So that's one of the reasons that a lot of recipes call for koshering salt. Mislabeled kosher salt, it's actually koshering salt. Anyway, it doesn't have iodine in it. Kitchen chemicals, baking soda and baking powder, I've talked about those. Starches like arrowroot and cornstarch can help provide structure into the food you're making. Spices, not pictured here, but I've talked a little bit about the way spices work. Vinegar is an acid. Honey is a simple fructose sugar. And then dairy products. Now, strangely enough, these creatures, these entities, these, I don't know what you call them,
Ovum.
objects, these ovum, are often grouped with dairy, even though they don't come voluntarily from cows. They come from chickens. I think chickens and cows are fairly distantly related in the genetic tree of life. But eggs are stored at the similar temperatures as a lot of dairy products, so you often find them in the dairy section. So because they're in the dairy section, they're often grouped as dairy products. But the lactose sugar, to which some people are intolerant, the lactose sugar in milk is C12H22O11. That's the same as sucrose. It's exactly the same chemical formula as table sugar. But some people can digest table sugar, but not lactose. Well, that's again because of the isomer, the different shape. Eggs have interesting, complicated structure to them. I'm running a little low on time, so I'm not going to delve into that, but I recommend that you look it up. The yolk is mostly, I'll say a couple words about it quickly. Yolk is mostly fat, and the white is a lot of proteins that can denature and form long sheets and threads, and as it does so, its optical properties change. And that's why egg yolks become white when you cook them, and opaque. So lots of interesting chemistry that goes on as it involves eggs and the way we use eggs in cooking. The fats in eggs, especially the yolks, can be used as an emulsifier to trap other things that would typically be suspensions, so we can use either the whites or the yolks. By the way, there are some things when it says egg whites and other things that say when they add to use egg yolks. Do not contaminate your egg whites with an egg yolk. Be careful about that. You know, if you split an egg and, oh goodness, that's too bad, I got a little bit of yolk in, well, I'm not going to worry about it. Just throw it away, start over again. Yolks can contaminate the chemical cooking process of things that require only egg whites. All right, pinnacle of food science, apple pie. One of the things about apple pie is when you cook an apple pie, you may find that the apples settle and decompress as they're cooked in an oven. One of the ways to avoid that is to blanch them with boiling water before you put them in the pie and before you spice them and season them. That blanching causes a chemical reaction with the pectin and other proteins in the apples that causes them to firm up, and that firmness persists through baking. So if you don't want your apples to settle into a mush in an apple pie, blanch them with hot water. The crust. There's a special science that involves how do you make a good crust. Typically, you add really cold bits of butter. The way I do it, people have commented that they like my crust. I cut butter, take a stick of butter, I cut it in half, I turn it over, I cut it in half again to make fourths, and then I slice those into about little half-inch little cubes. and I put those, and I've taken the butter out of the freezer at this point. And I take these frozen butter cubes and I mix them with a food processor with short pulses. You don't want to do it for a long time because it'll heat up the butter. Short little pulses in a food processor to mix that frozen butter in with the flour and sugar. And the end result of that is generally a pretty flaky crust. As you subsequently roll that out, you get sheets of butter that separate the gluten-binding sheets of flour. And then ice cream is a suspension of vanilla, which has been deemed the most favored flavor of all humans, on average. If you ask, if you do a survey, global survey, favorite flavors, vanilla tops the list. Now, it may not be your favorite flavor, but statistically speaking, it's people's favorite flavor. Vanilla ice cream, you get tiny, the trick is to get tiny little crystals of ice. If you get large crystals within things, that's when your ice cream goes bad. You taste ice with large crystals, and it's mostly water crystals, and it just doesn't taste good. Mm-hmm. The crystals aren't thoroughly mixed with the cream. Similarly, freezer burn on things is where the water migrates to the surface and freezes crystals. The food is still technically edible, but the flavor is compromised and the food is dried out. So that's a little bit about food science for you. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you if you persisted through my little bonus content. I appreciate it. Have a good and healthy weekend, and we'll see you again in December.
Right. Susan Ross came up with a couple of other points about Inuits. Inuits evidently got carbs from local plants, including nuts, leaves, stems, roots, and tubers. They also ate animals that ate a variety of wild plants, and often they ate the digested plant matter inside the animals' stomachs. Okay. She says more information than we probably wanted.
That's great.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Thank you to all who tuned in. Thank you to the DuPage Church. Thank you to those of you who will watch this after the live stream. Feel free to contact Mike or I. You can leave messages on the YouTube videos, or you can send us an email if you have our email addresses. We're happy to respond. And remember, this is your Science Sunday, too. We welcome your feedback and participation, even if it's virtual. Take care. See you later.
So long.